Alright gang, we are back. Similar to the video I put out a couple months ago, this is going to be a reading recap of everything that I read in May and June. And y'all will find out shortly, but I kind of dialed it up over the course of the last couple months. And I'm excited to share what I've been reading lately with you. If you've read these books, have different opinions, want to highlight some other stuff you've read in the last couple of months, get in the comments. I like conversations about books so much more than I like monologues about books, so I'd love to hear from y'all too. In that vein, please like this video and subscribe to the Guys Can Read YouTube channel for more videos, more guys, more reading. Anyway. May and June roundup, here we go. In May and June, I finished 11 books. And I would call this like 75% of my full power. Like, we're not quite Super Saiyan 3, but maybe we're Super Saiyan 1. Honestly, I'm not sure. I didn't finish Dragon Ball Z. I really just watched like 30 episodes in order to get to that one scene.
It's over 9,000!
And in my opinion, 11 books is a pretty solid effort. In my last video, I said I needed to be reading more, which I did. Indeed read more in the last couple months. My target this year is 52 books, one a week, and at the end of June I was sitting pretty at 30 of 52 books read for my 2024 reading goal. I'm about 58%. And this feels good because I definitely spent more time in May and June reading versus the amount that I read in March and April. So it's nice to see that pay off. Now, do I feel like I can be reading even more than I am now? Absolutely. There are days when I won't touch a book and days when I'll read for 6+ hours. So I think the trick in the next couple months is going to be averaging those out, or at least doing like an hour on days where I don't feel like reading or otherwise would have put up 0. I also had some books over the course of the last couple months which were very bingeable that probably also contributed to my higher reading numbers, but I'll get into that momentarily. What a great segue. Starting off May, we've got The Geography of Nowhere by James Howard Kunstler. Kunstler is a funny dude. I've never seen an author, blogger, or tweeter so hopelessly in love with American cities the way they used to be, and correspondingly so outraged by what American cities have become nowadays. This is largely a book about urbanism, and through Kunstler's snark and backhanded comments, it is also a commentary on what makes cities in America great. Spoiler alert, the answer is main streets with no parking, mixed-use buildings, and exclusively pedestrian traffic. At least in Kunstler's opinion. Mine too, I guess. But he also talks about architectural conventions and zoning codes which corrupted the ideal city and brought us to our present state. And as a result of that specifically first part about architectural stuff, this is not a book I'd recommend to a lot of people. Honestly, it's pretty inaccessible since a ton of the first half of the book is talking about architecture and the development of the highway system, and he doesn't make it personable in the way that, say, like Henry Graybar does through Paved Paradise. But in the back half of the book, once Kunstler gets around to making his points, it's tough not to get up in arms over the decline of American cities. This book is sort of a long rant that stands up a few arguments throughout, and if you can see past the trees for the forest and are interested in urbanism, then this is a book that you'll enjoy. I ended up giving this book 2 stars because, while the message is definitely good, it got bogged down by the details and the arc of the book overall. And for the majority of people who aren't going to read more than 1 or 2 books on urbanism, I think this is probably one of the weaker offerings in that genre. Side note, if you haven't put it together between Paved Paradise in the last reading recap and Geography of Nowhere in this one, urbanism is something that I care a lot about. I may end up doing a video on my top urbanist books. If I do, it probably won't be until the end of the year because I've got 3 urbanism books in my TBR list right now and 1 completed book that I would need to go and revisit in order to make a video on it. So stay tuned. Okay, second up in May is the memoir of America's fun dad and genuinely one of the coolest guys I think to ever exist, namely Dave Grohl, whose memoir is titled The Storyteller. This was a fun read, in part because Grohl's story is so much bigger than the Foo Fighters. For example, middling fans will know about Grohl from the Foo Fighters, slightly better fans will know that Grohl was also in Nirvana, and the really top tier, god tier of fans know about Scream and Grohl's dropping out of high school to join a rock band and tour the country. I was not one of those fans, for the record. I did know about Nirvana, I did not know about Scream. Over the course of this book, we do get a lot of really cool moments and some very not cool moments, as you might extrapolate from Grohl's association with Nirvana. The early Foo Fighter days, as well as Grohl's days of touring with Scream, were some of my personal favorites, and the latter really showcases that sort of starving artist thing that you will sometimes read about. I thought the book was a little weaker in the chapter where Grohl goes deep on his personal life and his relationships with his daughters and his wife. You can obviously detect the sentimentality on these pages, but it takes a pretty good writer to put words to these kinds of emotions, and Grohl basically had to settle for telling stories. Which, don't get me wrong, were great. And hey, I'm not a parent or a husband. What I wanted to read about, which were the stories of a band on the road, were the parts of this book that I enjoyed reading. But I would guess that a parent or other older fan might enjoy the personal chapters a little bit more than I did. End of the day, 3 stars for the Storyteller. I enjoyed the book, but I didn't love it. Fast read, excellent airplane book. Maybe check it out if you've got some time to kill. Okay, and now who is ready for a complete 180? The next book that I read in May was Steven Pinker's book, Rationality. Steven Pinker is if you don't know him, a psychologist, a thinker, sometimes a philosopher. Writes a lot of what some would call highbrow books, and Rationality is definitely one of those. Rationality, the book, is basically a dissertation on what rationality, the concept, is, or more loosely defined, just what is logical thinking, and why it's important. Out by a talk on why humans are frequently irrational, including biases and rationality when it comes to politics. Like I said, this book is a little highbrow. It's not what I would call a sexy book unless you enjoy following these nonfiction author types. Other people I would throw in this category are Yuval Noah Harari, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, Richard Thaler. This book specifically has a lot of close ties with behavioral economics. All that said, though, this is a super important book. The most important class that I took in college was completely unrelated to my major, and it was instead a core curriculum class called critical thinking. We learned formal logic, including if P then Q type of stuff, as well as common logical fallacies like denying the antecedent and strawmanning an argument. Now, knowing how to think and being able to point out your own logical shortcomings is a wildly useful skill, and one that's helped me out from time to time, both in work and writing. For the math nerds here, Pinker spends a decent amount of time on Bayesian logic, or conditional probability, which all people should at least be familiar with, even if you don't know the math behind it, as well as multiple regression, this and Bayesian logic being 2 tools of rational decision making. I am a math nerd personally, and these 2 chapters were a lot of type 2 fun. I was also lucky enough to see Steven Pinker present on Rationality at the University of Washington's public lecture series, and I got my book signed. Look, see the signature? So, not because of the fact that I met Steven Pinker live, but for the contents of the book, I gave this book 3 stars. This book is really great if you haven't read the other behavioral econ sort of foundation texts, like Thinking Fast and Slow, Nudge, Fooled by Randomness. You get the idea. If you have, you're welcome to read this book. You're just going to hear a lot of ideas repeated. And that's fine, just something to be aware of. Pinker is also kind of a goat in this middle ground between psychology and philosophy. And his writing experience in this book specifically shines through in a way that Thaler and Kahneman don't really have. Good narrative structure, compelling arguments, not super entertaining though, unless you're a nerd. And speaking of nerds, our next book is also for the nerds, Doughnut Economics by Kate Raworth. And funny enough, this was also inspired by a talk that I went to at the University of Washington public lecture series, although in this case, I went to the talk before I read the book. Now, Raworth starts off the book with a potentially hot take. She says it's possible, and indeed it has happened, that traditional economic models, including the supply and demand charts, the yield curves, etc., conspicuously leave out a major player in the economy, namely the planet. So Raworth gives us the donut, where the lower limit of the donut in order to get in there is basic human achievement and happiness, and the upper limit of the donut is the maximum strain upon the planet that the planet will accept. Raworth's pitch from this point on in the book is that every city, state, country, company, whatever organizational unit you want to choose, should try to get themselves inside of the donut. And then she begins to pitch some ideas on how to do this. And I'll be honest, her ideas here in Doughnut Economics are pretty against the grain of how I was brought up in camp capitalism. One specific example, that growth is not a goal in of itself, and there's a time when you should stop growing. Red alert. But at the same time, I liked a lot of what she had to say in this book. For example, work open source so that others can prove their life at the same time as yours. Buy local. This should be obvious to most people, I hope. And maybe don't even buy with the standard US dollar, but some super local, newly devised microcurrency. I think a lot of right-leaning people, or at least people brought up under traditional economics, are going to scoff at some of her ideas. Personally, though, I loved this book. I'd recommend it to a number of people. I gave Doughnut Economics 4 stars. Although I'll caveat that for anybody who maybe hasn't taken an Econ 101 class, this book may be a little less approachable because she does sort of assume a fundamental understanding of sort of basic econ. That said, give this book a whirl, leave a comment if you do. I think Raworth's ideas here could be very, very interesting to try out in different communities. All right, next up in May, You got Daddy Hemingway. Yeah, he drinks. Yeah, he fucks, or at least writes like he does. Yeah, he makes women out to be accessories, or even worse, crazy. Is he a hell of a writer? Bet your ass that he is. I'll be honest, this next book, Garden of Eden, by Ernest Hemingway, was a weird pick and one that I wouldn't have chosen if a friend hadn't given me the book as she was moving to London. Thank you, Caitlin. It's also a weird pick within the context of Hemingway because this book was incomplete at the time of Ernie's death in 1961. And honestly, there was a notable switch towards the end of the book when the writing seemed to take a sharp left turn. And this might be attributable to the fact that Hemingway hadn't finished the book when he died. But that said, the book itself is basically a love story with an unhappy ending. The main characters are David and Catherine Bourne, a recently married couple where David is a writer and Catherine has been financing his work. The two are on vacation around Western Europe, France and Spain for the most part, and in their leisure days of swimming, fishing, tanning, drinking, eating, Catherine begins to act a little funny. She comes back one day with her hair cut very short like a boy's, wearing masculine clothing, and asks David to get his haircut in the same fashion so the two look like twins and less like a couple. From this point, we go on a journey where Catherine increasingly begins to play with gender roles, telling David things like, now I'm going to be the man and you be the woman. In the interest of not spoiling the book, I'll leave you with a cliffhanger here that David is confused by this behavior at first, but I won't go any more in depth on that from there. I gave this book 2 out of 5 stars. I will not read it again. Eat your heart out if you want to give it a go. Was this an interesting book? Sure. Do I wish I had read a different Hemingway book instead? Yes. Would I recommend that you read this book? Probably not, but it was interesting. And it was one of the earlier books that I've seen deal with androgyny or reversal in gender roles. So good on Ernie for that. The 6th book that I read in May and the last book that I read in May. This is Portrait of a Thief by Grace D. Lee. This was the Guys Can Read May pick, and I was pretty excited about this book. It was described as Ocean's 11 meets The Farewell, which I've never seen, but I've heard great things about. And I was pretty hyped, all said and done, walking into this book. And then I started reading it. God damn, did this book have potential. Grace D. Lee locks on to 2 interesting ideas really early. First off, what's it like to be a child of the Chinese diaspora? And second, should art from China or other colonized countries live in Western societies or in the countries that it was taken from once upon a time? And then she fucking blew it. This book is about a heist crew of 5 college-age individuals, and much to my dismay, the book was correspondingly horny. Little group dynamics here. Will, the main character and heist mastermind, met Alex, the hacker on Bumble. They decided they'd just be friends. Daniel, the thief, has this unrequited love thing going on with Irene, the con woman, Will's sister, who's also a lesbian. Will basically seduces Lily, Irene's roommate, and the team's getaway driver to get her to participate in the heists. And there's 2 other developing relationships that happen over the course of the book that I won't even get into here for spoilers. Everyone is making fuck eyes at each other throughout this entire book, and Grace Lee never lets us forget it. Now, let alone, I could have chalked this up to okay, I'm not the audience for this book, whatever. But good lord, the suspension of disbelief required to accept that 5 kids are basically able to pull off heists of some of the biggest museums in the world by watching heist movies to prepare was way too much for me. I'll end my rant there. And oh yeah, I guess it's probably time for a synopsis too. Will, who's a college senior at Harvard, is approached by this mysterious rich person from China who offers Will something like $50 million to steal back art that was taken from China during the burning of the old summer palace. Mysterious rich person makes the case convincingly enough that the art belongs to China and it should live in China. And Will, who's an art history major and Chinese American, is on board. He rounds his crew up to try and pull off these 5 heists. Plot ensues from there. At its best moments, I will say I really enjoyed this book. Daniel, the thief, and his father, who's coincidentally a art theft detective working against the heist group, have a really complex and real relationship that matures over the course of this book. And Alex, whose family lives in Chinatown in New York City, has some sweet moments in her story that talk about the love found in immigrant communities across the United States. And there's other moments which were cool where these kids who were maybe born in China, mostly grew up in the United States, question their connection to China, what it is to be Chinese, how much national love and pride they should feel. And those were really well done, and I think those moments were Grace Lee writing what she knew best. But at least for me, these were overshadowed by the heavy-handed use of romance and the skimmed-over heist plot points. Now, I gave Portrait of a Thief 2 stars, because for all the hate, there were parts of this I enjoyed, and honestly, for Guys Can Read, this book sparked a lot of fun conversations. For example, when should art be given back to the countries of origin, and how much slack do we cut first-time authors? Also, weird factoid, there was a lot of discussion here about the fact that Netflix bought the rights to the screen adaptation for Portrait of a Thief before the book was published. Do with that information what you will. And that concludes May. Now, this is a great middle point in this video, so go ahead and grab a drink, get a breath of fresh air, come back, sit down. Before we resume once again, don't be shy to like this video and subscribe to the Guys Can Read channel on YouTube. Now we get into June. And Babel by R.F. Kuang is where we're going to start off. I am so fucking glad that I read this book immediately after I read Portrait of a Thief, because at least under the lens of colonized countries taking back what's theirs, this book, namely Babel, is what Portrait of a Thief wishes it was. Now, this plot's going to be a little trickier to dance around, so I'll lead off with the synopsis of the book here. Robin Swift is an orphan who's plucked from his home in the Canton region of China to apprentice under an acclaimed silver worker, i.e. magician, in the UK. The story is mainly set after Robin turns 16 and begins school at Oxford University's Institute of Translation, colloquially known as Babel. First thing to love about Babel: fascinating magic system. Like a top 3 I've seen in the world of fantasy. Without thinking too much, I'll throw like Kingkiller Chronicles and Aragon in there too. I just love magic systems that are based on words. Now, back to the story of Babel. The UK has basically established their dominance of the world through the power of silver, which is used in magic. Spellcraft involves writing a match pair, or a word and its translation in another language, onto a bar of silver. The effect that the magic produces is the meaning that's lost in between the translation of one word and its match pair. So roads are lined with silver to make them easier to travel on. Ovens have silver bars in them in order to make your bread more nutritious. And sewers have silver in them to contain the scent of sewage from leaking out. You get the idea. Now, Robin, who's a child of Canton at Babel, is one of the few silver workers who can speak Cantonese and Mandarin, which makes him especially valuable to the Institute of Translation. But shortly after beginning school at Babel, Robin runs into a group called the Hermes Society, which has been working in the shadows attempting to steal silver bars back from Babel in order to give them to colonized countries or other groups working against the British Empire. And after agreeing to do some work with the Hermes Society, Robin is caught between his role as like a dutiful student and his desire to see justice done against the British Empire for basically enslaving and colonizing many countries abroad. And the rest of this book kind of plays with this tension, leading to what I can only describe as what is a large standoff towards the end of the book. Now, I don't know if you can call R.F. Kuang a rookie since her first book, The Poppy War, came out in 2018. If so, though, I think R.F. Kuang might be my rookie of the decade. Poppy Wars trilogy, 4 out of 5 stars. Fun with the whole series. Cool magic. Babel, 5 out of 5 stars. God damn, was this book good. Yellowface? Haven't read it, honestly, but I heard that it continues Kuang's streak, throwing a no-hitter. Now, she's been teasing her next book, too, called Catabasis, which is set to come out in August of 2025, and I'm sure that's going to be a hit, too. But Babel, similar to the Poppy Wars, does get a little tropey at times, and I would say that's one of its weak points. And how can you not, when the basic setting for the story is an academy in Great Britain? But Robin's angle as a protagonist, being Chinese-British, and pulled away from his community, made this so much stronger than a lot of the trope-driven stuff that's out there. We also get, like, this really fun cast of supporting characters, including a girl named Letty, who I thought Kuang wrote incredibly well as a representative of your average well-meaning white person in colonial societies. Start to finish, the twists and turns and savagery present in parts of this book, along with Kuang's genius on display via the magic of silverworking, made this book so much fun to read, and I'm sure I'll be back reading it again before long. Now, I'm going to brag a little and say that similar to Kuang, I have also been on a hot streak, because I read 3 5-star books in a row over the course of June. And I owe that, at least 2/3 of that, to Pierce Brown and the Red Rising trilogy. Now, if you've read these books, you can skip to Parable of the Sower, because you know exactly what I'm going to say here. Every person who's read Red Rising has said the same thing. Namely, bro, please, you've got to read Red Rising. Come on. It's just 6 quick little books. Darrow Andromedus, the Reaper of Mars, needs your support. Per aspera ad astra, bro, please. Just read one and then I'll convince you to read the rest of them. That's genuinely the reaction I've seen from everybody who's read the Red Rising series, or at least the original trilogy. Before I picked up the first book itself, named Red Rising, I had no less than 8 people recommend this series to me. Hunger Games, but better, and set in space, was how they billed it to me. And for the most part, I think that's a pretty accurate description. And just for the record, I'm talking about Red Rising and Golden Sun a little bit here. I will keep it as non-spoiler as possible. And if you're keeping count at home of the books that I read in May and June, these are 2 books that I'm doing with one part of the video. The series of books follows Darrow, a Red from the mining colony of Lycos on Mars. Being a Red means that Darrow is the lowest on the ladder of the hierarchical color society that they live in. Reds are considered the worst, and they and the other colors all bow to the Golds, which are the highest level. Shortly, however, Darrow is thrust out of his mining colony and invited to participate in a dangerous mission. Infiltrate Gold Society, pose as one of them, and ultimately aid the Reds in overthrowing society and its color hierarchy. Now, the majority of the Red Rising, the first book in the series, takes place at the Institute, an academy for Golds who will eventually go into military service and become peerless scarred. Golden Sun, without spoiling too much, takes place beyond the confines of the Institute on Mars, and we start to see the universe open up more. Darrow and the cast of characters surrounding him are so well developed and impossible not to root for, normally, that you get caught up in the emotion of the story really, really quickly. There are also so many twists and turns in these books from a plot perspective. Some friends and I actually determined that these books operate on a pendulum, swinging from "it's so over" to "we're so back." This all to say that while the comparisons to the Hunger Games are deserved, underdog repressed by society tries to rise up, get justice against the ruling class, and the entire first book is literally just a war game. Red Rising and the subsequent books are truly in a league of their own. I put both Red Rising and Golden Sun, the first 2 books in this series, at 5 stars out of 5 stars. Masterworks, both of them great for different reasons. Now, I didn't finish Morningstar Book 3 and Iron Gold Book 4 until July, so I'm not going to include them in this video. But realistically, by the time August is over, I'm also going to have Dark Age Book 5 and Lightbringer Book 6 finished, which means I'll have read all the books that have come out in this series by the time I publish my next reading recap. And I have some other fun stuff in the Red Rising Universe series coming up too, so make sure you subscribe. Alright, nearly there. Book 10 is Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. Parable has been called one of the great, modern science fiction books. So I was stoked that we got the chance to read it for Guys Can Read in June. It turns out this book is equal parts disturbing and incredible. Incredible because Butler conjures up this amazing protagonist in Lauren Oya Olamina and does phenomenal world building, and is just generally a really, really good writer who knows her tone perfectly and clearly has developed a mastery of writing fiction. Now, Parable of the Sower was very disturbing because it holds up a really ugly mirror showing a dystopian 2024 which is not that far of a stretch from the 2024 we're living in right now. I may do a deep dive on Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents at some point, so I'll save the in-depth analysis for that. But Jesus Christ, was this book creepy. Butler published Parable of the Sower in 1993, and writes about a dystopian United States in the year 2024. She talks about how climate change has eroded the agriculture and economy of California, where the story is set, and how many Californians have fled for Oregon, Washington, and Alaska, where the crime is lower, temperatures more mild, jobs more abundant. States have also basically formed borders between themselves and are hyper-regional. The US government doesn't have the reach, power, or desire to help people on the ground in states like California, and is also increasingly laissez-faire, really just meant for maintaining the army and the occasional federal service. Scary stuff all around, and between Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, the picture Butler paints of 2024 and 2033, when the next book is set, is really grim and in certain ways tons of parallel to life today. Anyway, this creeped me out, and it was so cool, I gave Parable of the Sower 4 out of 5 stars. I actually ended up rating Parable of the Talents higher, but I will save that for a next reading recap. I haven't really gotten into it, so quick plot summary here. Parable is at its core like a dystopian science fiction set in the year 2024, where America is plagued by climate change, economic instability, and societal collapse. The main character is Lauren Olamina, who is a young African-American woman with a condition called hyperempathy, causing her to feel the pain and pleasures of others as she witnesses them experiencing it. Lauren lives in a walled community with her family in Robledo, California, but as society begins to crumble and worsen around them, Robledo is more and more under siege by dangerous criminals and pyromaniacs who want to steal what Lauren's community has built. The other through line here, aside from the goings-ons of the world at large, is Lauren's journaling. As she writes about how the world can possibly be unfucked, she discovers this religion by writing about it that she calls Earthseed, which preaches that God is change, and the destiny of Earthseed is to spread out and find new homes among the stars, quite literally. Now, I won't say any more than that because, like, most of the joy of Parable can be found in growing your understanding of Earthseed along with Lauren. But just know that this is a super fun ride, even if at times it's super sad and super depressing. And finally, book 11 brings us to the end of our ride for June. This is The Poisoner's Handbook by Deborah Blum. This book is cool because it's practically a history of the dawn of forensic chemistry or forensic science in New York during and after prohibitions in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. Forensic chemistry, i.e. the detection of poisons used to cause death, basically came up alongside the first established office of the chief medical examiner. In New York, the office and this field of study was driven by two men, Charles Norris, who was the first chief medical examiner of New York, and his head toxicologist named Alexander Gettler. This book is really cool because it weaves together the development of forensic science alongside, like, basically what's a new true crime case every chapter, dealing with mostly unique poisons like mercury, carbon monoxide, arsenic, and wood alcohol. Each chapter also goes into detail about how Gettler and Norris eventually tested and figured out the cause of death, like they were in CSI. And the story of these two and the creation of the first chief medical examiner's office honestly kind of reads a little like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Their work developing standard operating procedures, usurping the previous corrupt system of coroners, and winning budget and comically the right to maintain a fleet of cars was a really fun, like, underdog story. These two little guys from the medical profession were fighting an uphill battle, but ultimately they were on the side of justice. There were a ton of asides in this book about the importance of the work that Norris and Gettler were doing, but the best of them made mention about how other high-up professionals were coming to Norris and Gettler for, like, consultations, and basically these two guys owned this field of study for a couple decades in the 20s and 30s. Now, I give this book 3 stars. At the end of the day, true crime just really isn't my jam, and a major part of this book is constituted by pages talking about, like, these different poisonings that were done during Jazz Age New York. I think I would have been happier overall if, like, I'd gotten a book that was half this length and exclusively about, like, Norris and Gettler's creation of the agency, as well as their fighting with Tammany Hall. And there you have it. That is my reading recap for May and June. If you like this video and want to see more like it, please leave a comment. I'd always love to hear about what you're reading and enjoying because I am on the hunt for good books. Always. Other than that, go ahead and like this video if you'd be so kind. Subscribe to the Guys Can Read YouTube channel. And if you feel inclined to join the mailing list or potentially join a live book discussion in your city, you can find a link to the mailing list in the video description. It's been real. It's been fun. Let's do it again soon.